The courtroom froze as the homeless man in chains whispered to the judge, "I saluted you once, sir." The judge didn't blink. Until hours later he opened a file and saw his own signature on the soldier's commendation. A war hero, now in jail for sleeping outside. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The manila folder sat like a landmine on Judge Maddox's desk, unassuming but poised to detonate. He didn't touch it at first, just stared at the name typed clean across the top. Staff Sergeant Daniel J. Reed. The weight of recognition hit him like the butt of a rifle to the chest. He'd reviewed hundreds of case files that day, but this one bled through the paper. He opened it slowly, as if each turn of the page might betray him further. The contents weren't long: a Department of Defense commendation for valor under fire, a faded photograph of a lean, hardened soldier standing beside a Blackhawk with dust in his hair and resolve in his eyes, and finally a handwritten note from Maddox himself, dated nearly 2 decades earlier. To SSG Daniel Reed, your actions saved not just men, but morale. Your conduct is the kind of honor I hope this country never forgets. Meiji, Ronald Maddox. The words clawed at his conscience. He remembered writing them, though not the face. War had a way of stripping people down to outlines, roles, responsibilities, ranks. But now, in that courtroom, stripped of uniform and dignity, Daniel Reed hadn't looked like a soldier. He looked like a stain, and Maddox had treated him like one. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly aware of how loud the ticking clock had become. It was the same one he'd had since law school, an heirloom from his father, another judge, another voice of law and order. Maddox had always believed in the sanctity of rules, but now, for the first time in decades, he felt them warp under him like scorched metal. That morning he'd called Daniel a vagrant, a delinquent, a disgrace. Now the echo of, "I saluted you once, sir," burrowed into his memory with surgical precision. He had dismissed it as contempt, but it wasn't contempt. It was a reminder, a whisper from the foxholes of a shared past, where men bled and trusted, where they followed orders not out of fear, but out of belief. Maddox pulled the courtroom transcript and reread the charges. Trespassing. Contempt. He stared at the word contempt like it had betrayed him. Not Reed. He had been contemptuous. Contemptuous of pain he hadn't seen. Contemptuous of the wreckage war left behind in human souls. He flipped through the pages again, searching for something redemptive. What he found instead was a VA medical report: severe PTSD, degenerative joint damage from embedded shrapnel, and a flagged application for disability that had been pending for 9 months. Maddox gritted his teeth. Bureaucracy had its own kind of violence. The judge in him knew the law had been followed to the letter, but the man, the soldier, felt hollow. A man he once commended had been processed like debris in a system designed to move fast and forget faster. He stood up and looked out his office window at the fading light cutting across the courthouse lawn. Shadows stretched long, dragging behind the cars and people heading home. And somewhere out there, Daniel Reed was sitting in a cell for being broken where he once stood whole, for surviving in a country that had promised not to leave him behind. A knock at the door startled him. His clerk poked her head in. "Your Honor, do you want to proceed with arraignments, or—" He didn't answer right away. The words were slow, reluctant. "No, postpone them. I need a minute." She nodded and withdrew. He turned back to the folder. Slowly, deliberately, Maddox reached for a yellow legal pad. His fingers hovered for a moment before he began to write, not as a judge, but as a man remembering another. Each stroke of the pen was heavy, not with ink, but with guilt, the kind that doesn't fade with time. Judge Ronald Maddox had not slept. The hours between midnight and dawn stretched endlessly, haunted by images that had long ago been buried beneath robes and rulings. They came back now with ruthless clarity: the choking black smoke, the metallic shriek of twisted Humvee doors, the searing heat of fire licking at flesh and canvas. And in the middle of it all, a soldier, Daniel Reed, dragging him from the inferno, blood soaking through his fatigues, eyes sharp with fear and focus. Now, that same man was shackled like a criminal. The bourbon sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Maddox's hands rested on the folder, the commendation glowing beneath the overhead light like an accusation. The paper had yellowed slightly over time, but the ink was crisp. His own signature stared back at him, clean, confident, final. Linda entered silently, robe wrapped tightly, her eyes already reading the weight in his posture. "You know this man?" she asked. Maddox didn't turn. His voice cracked with the gravity of unspoken truth. He pulled 3 men out of a burning vehicle. One of them was me. Linda said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence was steady, grounding. But her silence carried a question louder than any judgment. "What will you do now?" At 6:47 a.m., Maddox signed an order to rearraign Daniel Reed that morning. In his courtroom, in person. He included an addendum, handwritten, "All restraints to be removed during the hearing." By 9:05, the courtroom buzzed with confusion. The regulars had noticed something was off. Bailiffs whispered. Reporters stirred. Maddox's clerk looked nervously at the docket, unsure how to interpret the morning's reversal. Then Daniel entered, his gait uneven, knees stiff, pain etched into his every step. He wore the same tattered jacket, the same worn boots, but this time there were no chains on his wrists. He paused briefly before the defense table, locking eyes with Maddox, who sat tall and unflinching on the bench. The gavel did not strike. Instead, Maddox stood, a violation of courtroom custom that drew murmurs from the gallery. His voice, when it came, was deliberate, stripped of judicial distance. "Mr. Reed, I believe I owe you more than an apology." Daniel's face didn't change, but something imperceptible shifted in the room. He leaned forward slightly. "Do you even remember me now?" he asked, not with anger, but with the weary expectation of someone who's been forgotten too many times. Maddox nodded once. "I do. I remember every minute of that day. I remember how you screamed at me to crawl. I remember the way you used your own body to shield mine. I remember the pain, and the blood, and the smoke, and I remember thinking I wasn't going to make it out. But you pulled me out anyway." He took a breath. "Yesterday, I failed you. Not as a judge, but as a man. I saw your condition and labeled you a nuisance. I saw your silence as defiance. I saw your presence as a threat to my authority instead of as proof of your survival." He turned toward the gallery. "This courtroom runs on principles, on law and order and respect. But those principles mean nothing if they are not extended to every person who walks through that door. Yesterday I disrespected not just this man, but the oath I swore to uphold." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few heads turned toward Daniel, who stood as still as stone. Maddox continued, "I am vacating the contempt charge. The fine is dismissed. And I will be personally petitioning the court to review Mr. Reed's status with the Department of Veterans Affairs. No one who has carried the weight of this nation on his back should be discarded because he carries the scars of that service." A pause. Then Maddox looked at Daniel once more, and for a moment the room disappeared. The court, the crowd, the cameras. It was just the two of them again, standing in the heat of memory, bound not by war, but by what followed. "You saved my life. It's time I did something with it." It began with paperwork, but it didn't end there. Judge Ronald Maddox wasn't a man known for second chances. His reputation had been forged in steel, unwavering, disciplined, sometimes harsh. But something fundamental had shifted the day he recognized Daniel Reed in chains. A crack in the marble of his worldview, a fracture deep enough to let the light in. He didn't wait for bureaucracy. He made calls, dozens of them, to directors at the Department of Veterans Affairs, to housing coalitions, to local mental health organizations, career centers, donors, and anyone else who would take his call. Some were hesitant, others laughed. "A judge setting up a shelter?" one scoffed. Maddox didn't flinch. "Not a shelter," he said, "a foundation." He named it Operation Groundback, a deliberate soldier's term. It wasn't about rescue, it was about reclaiming dignity, identity, purpose. Not a handout, but a mission. Daniel Reed was the first to enroll, but redemption isn't a photograph, it's a grind. In the first week, Daniel missed 2 appointments. The shelter director called Maddox personally. "He's not reliable," she said. "You sure he's worth all this?" "He dragged me through burning wreckage," Maddox replied flatly. "I can drag him through paperwork." He showed up where Daniel was, sometimes at shelters, sometimes under bridges, sometimes in the quiet corners of alleyways where old veterans vanished into brick and memory. Maddox wasn't dressed like a judge on those visits. He wore jeans, carried sandwiches, never brought a camera, never made a speech. And Daniel, slowly, began to show up too. A caseworker got him into therapy for PTSD. A volunteer helped him polish his resume. A local business owner, once prosecuted by Maddox, ironically, offered part-time work. Daniel got clean, then he relapsed. Then he came back stronger. It wasn't linear, it wasn't pretty, but it was movement. When the public ceremony finally arrived 6 months later, it was meant to be modest. A press release had gone out, a small community event to celebrate the first cohort of veterans to complete the Operation Groundback program. But word had spread. National outlets picked up the story of the judge and the homeless vet. Cameras swarmed the city hall lawn. Lawmakers showed up in suits. A senator asked to speak. But the moment belonged to Daniel. He walked onto the stage in a crisp charcoal suit, tie knotted with care, hair trimmed close. His stance was squared, the way he'd once stood at attention in the desert. The crowd fell silent. Before approaching the mic, Daniel turned and embraced Maddox. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't performative. It was the quiet, bone-deep gratitude of 2 men who had carried each other out of fire. Then Daniel stepped forward. "I was invisible," he began. "People saw the beard, the bag, the muttering, and they looked away. I slept in alleys behind buildings I once guarded in uniform. I stopped asking for help because help stopped coming." He paused. "But someone didn't forget me. He remembered me not just as a soldier, but as a man. I once saved this man's life. Then he saved mine. That's how it should be. We don't leave each other behind." The crowd rose, not with polite applause, but with something more primal. A standing ovation not just for a man, but for a possibility. That wounds could heal, that systems could bend, that mercy could mean more than judgment. The photo went viral. A judge in black robes standing beside a veteran in a gray suit, arms linked. 2 men once separated by distance, now united by duty. It was shared not because it was dramatic, but because it was right. In courtrooms, the gavel represents finality, but in that moment, it represented beginning. Sometimes the law must be cold, but justice, true justice, requires warmth. And the most powerful verdict a judge can render is compassion in action.